All right. So the domino theory was why we had to not allow for the elections, because this was going to lead to all these countries becoming communist. And what we're going to find in 1970, when Daniel Ellsberg actually releases the Pentagon Papers, that most of the people who were making these policies didn't really think that the domino theory was a real thing. That if Vietnam becomes communist, it's mostly poor people who are rice farmers. My U.S. history teacher in high school, who was A, a very great storyteller, B, a complete Anglophile, everything England did was awesome, and C, may have gotten in trouble a couple times for sexual harassment, but I think it was all rumor. Alright, it was speculation. I will tell you that he did put all the hottest girls in the front row.
That's not.
And Andrew's like, good. But he told me this. This is what my history teacher said in high school. Listen. 100 years before this, they were a bunch of rice farmers. Now they're communists. Guess what they do?
Farmers.
They're a bunch of rice farmers. I was like, okay. He was really funny. He came to school one day with an all black button-down shirt, black jeans, black cowboy boots, and a black cowboy hat. And he had just gone to a Marty Stewart concert. He's really into Marty Stewart. And I said, his name was Tom Jones. And I said, Mr. Jones, how was the concert? He goes, it was the greatest experience of my life. And I said, but you're married with children. He goes, that should tell you something. I was like, you are awesome. He got mad at me one time. I don't know if you told this, but on most of my tests, I would put A, don't bother grading at the top of it when I knew I had done well. I was a little bit arrogant. And he got so sick of my arrogance, he's like, if you think you're so smart, you teach the class. So I got up and I taught class for one day. I was like, I got this. And I got up there, and it was the Korean War, and I stood there and I was like, nothing. I know nothing about the Korean War, so I made it up. Kids were taking notes, like it happened in, on the peaks of Mount Rushmore.
I can see you completely making up like the Korean War in our class.
I will tell you that one of my classes in college, one of my U.S. history classes, we had to do this project. I did mine on the election in 1968. And it was a really cool project, and we all had to give it, like a talk about it, and we got asked questions. And somebody asked me a question. I didn't know the answer. Now, traditionally, obviously I did my work, like it was a good project I had done. I didn't know the answer. If you don't know an answer and your teacher, what should you say?
Something.
I don't know. I don't know. I'll look that up and I'll get back with you. That's a reasonable thing to say. I just started making stuff up. And the professor was like, wow. She actually went, wow. And she started taking notes. It was stuff that she had never known before. Oh my gosh, this is great research, Corey. Where'd you get this? And I was like, oh, I got it in the, in the files of whatever. She's like, wow. And she was taking it. She goes, I can't believe this. This really happened? And I was like, no. I just made up the last 5 minutes of class.
Did you admit to you?
Yes, I admitted to her that I had made it all up. She goes, does this really happen? I went, no, I just made it all up. And she was like, oh, that's pretty disappointing. This is really good stuff. First time I had made up history, not the last. So what are our 2 responses to no DM in the election? 1, the domino theory, we push for this. And number 2, this is when we start SEATO, the Southeastern Treaty Organization. What is this like?
NATO.
It's like NATO, right? Now there's also 2 groups you understand when we use them. Have you seen movies and you hear people call, say, the Viet Cong?
Yeah.
Who are the Viet Cong?
Gorilla.
There were 2 groups. Listen, just because you live down here didn't mean you automatically love no DM or you're pro-American. If you are from the North, if you're a North Vietnamese fighter, you're part of the National Liberation Front. If you were the Viet Cong, if you were part of the National Liberation Front, then you were like an official soldier. The Viet Cong was South Vietnamese underground fighters. The Viet Cong fought with the National Front. And one of the problems that fighters were having is they never knew who was on their own side. Because the South had fighters who were pro-American, right? Army, Southern Vietnamese Army, they were pro-American. And then they had the North Vietnamese, and then you also find the Viet Cong. And the problem was you never know who was on your side. So you can be walking down, you know, you've seen this in a bunch of movies, where they'll have a platoon and they're walking down a road, and you have rice farmers who are farming the rice, and they take up, and they pop up with an AK-47, they take out 3 platoon leaders, and they pop back down, and you don't know who did it. You don't know who did it, you don't know who's good, you don't know who's bad, you don't know who's on your side, the other side. And this is one reason why you see a lot of atrocities during the war, because soldiers got really frustrated, they didn't know who was on their side. And they were losing, and so oftentimes instead of choosing who was the good people and the bad people, they just killed everybody. Right? And this is what leads to some atrocities. During the war, we're talking, Americans lost 58,000 soldiers, the Vietnamese lost over 3 million. Right? I mean, there's a huge amount of people who were lost. Now, what was Kennedy's response, and where did Kennedy go into this? Kennedy did increase the number of soldiers. Like, we had like a couple hundred soldiers in the late 50s there. By the time Kennedy left, we had 16,000 American soldiers, and they were called advisors. They were training the South Vietnamese, they were providing assistance. Theoretically speaking, they were not leading missions into the field on their own. Now, what the CIA was doing might have been different. But many have speculated, as No became more unpopular and that Monk set himself on fire, that was on November 1st. So that was in October of '63. A coup overthrew No and killed him November 1st, which was, again, 3 weeks before Kennedy was assassinated. But people can't agree on whether or not Kennedy would have pulled troops back or whether he would have escalated like Johnson did. I don't think that he would have escalated like Johnson did because he was suspicious of the CIA and some of the stuff they were giving him that Johnson wasn't suspicious of. But I can't tell you how important that Monk setting himself on fire was in terms of changing attitudes about what's going on. In fact, have we seen anything like that recently? The Arab Spring. Do you know what country started the Arab Spring?
Egypt. No?
Tunisia. It was in Tunisia. And one of the things that galvanized support was a man set himself on fire in the street in Tunisia. You can very easily go back to the starting point of the Arab Spring. I mean, obviously a lot of frustration was building up over the years, but the actual action point, this is the most extreme form of protest, right? And Tunisia falls, Egypt falls, Libya falls, the Middle East, right now there's a civil war in Syria, right? Jordan is making all these concessions, giving more power to Congress. The dynamic is changing in the Middle East, and much of it, you could say, comes from what this guy did. And a lot of it comes from what this guy did in Vietnam. Because the photos make their way back to America. I mean, you're going to see it on YouTube. So, what happens with Johnson? Well, Johnson, whose Secretary of Defense was named Robert McNamara, actually he just died. And back in the 1990s, he wrote a book, and he actually took personal responsibility for Vietnam's failure. He was a really smart guy. But Johnson said, I can't have Vietnam going communist the way China did. I can't have Vietnam go the way of China. Now, if you are a thinking person, what might you say are some things to consider about that phrase that might be debatable?
Vietnam is not out of a billion people.
Yeah. Number one, Vietnam and China ain't the same thing. That's exactly right. What else?
It's not as close to Soviet Union either.
Well, think about the extent of American influence. Did
Who's he to say that Vietnam can't go communist?
Isn't this interesting? America now in a Cold War mindset, we will tell countries what they can or can't do internally, right? And do you think Truman could have stopped communism from happening in China? Probably not. What was he going to do? Unless he invaded China, and again, they have 1.2 billion people back then, what are you going to do? Right? But this is what's happened, and here is how we get into it. Okay? In 1964, right off, this is the Gulf of Tonkin right here. And off the coast of the Gulf of Tonkin, a few naval warships, a couple destroyers, were attacked. I think it was the USS Maddox, maybe? They were attacked by North Vietnamese. This was labeled the Gulf of Tonkin incident, that they were attacked in an unprovoked manner while they were cruising along the Gulf of Tonkin. What we're going to find later from the Pentagon Papers is that this was a lie. That actually they were attacked, but it was not unprovoked. That the Vietnamese were responding to American aggression. But that's not how it was given to Americans. This is in 1964. And what Congress does, the reaction to the Gulf of Tonkin, and this is critically important, is that Congress passed something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. In 1964, the Vietnam War was still, it was popular for America to get involved. Not escalate, but be involved. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gave President Johnson the power to escalate the war as he saw fit. Now before we move on, what do you think might be some problems with escalating a war as you see fit if you're giving that to the president?
He can do what he wants with it.
Well, yeah, right, but what's the... Think about this historically.
The president.
Well, yeah, but who declares war? Congress declares war. They give the president the right to war, but they're not declaring war here, are they? They're giving all the responsibility to the president. This is something the Founding Fathers would have been very, very uncomfortable with, giving an executive the power to sort of do whatever he's wanted. By the way, since World War II, and since Korea even, we keep doing this. And every single time we think, man, this is a bad idea. And something else comes up, and what do? The exact same thing. People have said the same thing when they've compared Iraq to Vietnam, was how much power the president was given to sort of escalate as his own will. But this document is what starts to further escalate the war. It's popular enough, and he wins the election of '64 very, very easily. And we begin Operation Rolling Thunder. That is the name. It's a cool name. But that's the name of the basis of our attacking in Vietnam. And so we started targeting, the head of all of the forces in Vietnam was a really, really smart, pretty young general named General William Westmoreland. And at first, we don't commit a ton of troops. We're trying to use a lot of air power because we have absurdly superior air superiority over the Vietnamese, right? And so we start bombing. You can see these trails. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, to get around American forces, they had these trails that went outside. They also had ridiculous amounts of tunnels. That's what tunnel rats did. They went in and tried to break up the tunnels and kill people in there. But we bombed the Ho Chi Minh Trail. What's one of the problems bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail, by the way?
You're not Vietnam.
You're not in Vietnam. You're bombing not Vietnam. We start bombing Hanoi like crazy. But in the end, this isn't as effective. And it's not causing enough problems, so we start escalating our number of troops. And we go about this much differently. I want you to look at this map real carefully, and I want you to look at the